Mr. Edward Harrington was a billionaire known for his vast empire, spanning industries from technology to real estate. Yet, despite all his wealth and power, he had one great concern: his only son, Adrian. Adrian had been raised in privilege, educated in the finest schools abroad, and now lived in New York, managing one of the family's overseas branches. But despite his success, Edward worried. Adrian was at the age where he should be settling down, but every woman he brought home seemed more interested in his wealth than in him. Edward had seen it before: fake love wrapped in beautiful smiles, ambition disguised as affection. He would not let his son fall into that trap. Determined to find a woman who would love Adrian for who he was, not for his fortune, Edward devised a plan. He would disguise himself as a gatekeeper at Harrington Industries, his own company, and quietly observe the employees. He wanted to find a woman with true kindness, humility, and a pure heart, someone who would make a worthy wife for his son. One evening, Edward called his trusted assistant, Mr. Cole, into his office. "I'm taking a leave of absence," Edward announced. "For the next few months, I will not be the CEO of this company." Mr. Cole raised an eyebrow. "Sir, that is impossible." "The board." "The board will follow my orders," Edward interrupted. "You will handle things in my absence, but I will still be here, just in a different way." The next morning, a new gatekeeper started at the main entrance of Harrington Industries. He wore an old uniform, his hair was dyed gray, and a pair of thick glasses rested on his nose. His name tag read Edwin, and nobody recognized him as Edward Harrington, the billionaire CEO. For the first time in decades, Edward saw his company from the ground level. Employees walked past him without a second glance. Some ignored him entirely, while others muttered quick greetings. He paid attention to their interactions, watching how they treated the lowest-ranked staff, janitors, security guards, and of course, himself. Days turned into weeks, and Edward remained unnoticed. Then, one afternoon, as he was wiping the rain off the company's glass doors, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Here, let me help you." He turned and saw a young woman in a simple office outfit kneeling beside him, using her handkerchief to wipe the glass. She smiled warmly. "You missed a spot," she said playfully. Edward studied her. She was different from the others, who rushed past him every day without a second glance. He had seen her before. Her name was Sophia Williams, a junior accountant in the finance department. Unlike many of her colleagues, she was always kind to everyone, regardless of their status. "You don't have to do this, miss," Edward said, testing her reaction. "But I want to," she replied. "My mother always taught me that no work is beneath anyone." Edward smiled. He had finally found her. The perfect wife for his son. But his plan was only beginning. Now, he had to test her further, and most importantly, he had to find a way to bring Adrian into the picture, without revealing who he truly was. Edward watched Sophia closely in the following weeks. She was always polite to everyone, from the janitors to the executives, but she wasn't naive. She worked hard, stayed late when necessary, and never sought attention. She wasn't like the women Adrian had dated in the past, the ones who flaunted designer bags and whispered about luxury vacations. Sophia seemed real. But kindness wasn't enough. Edward needed to be sure she wasn't just a good employee, he needed to know she was a good person. One evening, when most employees had gone home, Edward sat outside the company's lobby, pretending to doze off in his chair. The sky was darkening, and soon, it would rain. "Sir." A soft voice called. He opened his eyes and found Sophia standing there, holding an umbrella. "It's going to rain soon," she said. "Do you have a way home?" Edward let out a tired sigh, playing his role. My bus doesn't come for another hour." Sophia hesitated, then offered, "I can give you a ride." Edward studied her. Most employees would never invite a mere gatekeeper into their car. But Sophia wasn't like most. "That's very kind of you," he said. Sophia walked him to her car, a small, slightly worn-out sedan. Not the luxury cars the executives drove, but clean and well-kept. "You're too kind to an old man like me," Edward said as they drove. She chuckled. "My father was a security guard. I grew up watching him work long hours, and I know how hard-working people like you are. You deserve kindness too." Edward felt a warmth in his chest. Sophia wasn't just polite, she had a good heart. But now, it was time for the next phase of his plan. The next morning, Edward made a call to Adrian. "Son," he said, "I need you to return home for a while." Adrian sighed. "Dad, I'm running the New York branch. I can't just. I have a special project that requires your attention. Something important." Adrian groaned but knew better than to argue with his father. "Fine. I'll book a flight for this weekend." Edward smirked. His son was coming home. Now, all he had to do was bring Sophia and Adrian together, without revealing his true identity just yet. Edward's heart raced as the weekend approached. The stage was set. Adrian would arrive in just a few days, and he had a plan, one that was beginning to feel more like a tightrope walk. It wasn't just about testing Sophia's character anymore. It was about creating a chance for them to meet, to give Adrian a glimpse of her without revealing who he truly was. Sophia, of course, had no idea that the man she had been so kind to was, in fact, her future father-in-law. She only knew him as Edwin, the quiet, older gatekeeper with the stooped shoulders and graying hair. Edward had deliberately kept his distance from her, always appearing as an unremarkable, elderly figure. But as the days went on, he couldn't help but admire the warmth in her. She was everything he hoped for in a potential daughter-in-law, humble, kind, and grounded. When Adrian arrived, he was as Edward had expected, distracted by his work, always on his phone, only half engaged in conversations. The tall, handsome heir to the Harrington fortune had little time for family dinners or long talks. He was driven, yes, but Edward knew his son was missing something, a purpose, a partner to share his life with. Adrian had everything money could buy, but he was still lonely. Now, Edward just had to make the right connection. On the morning Adrian arrived, Edward quietly gave instructions to the HR department to organize a small office event. A casual get-together, he called it. Nothing too extravagant, just a chance to meet some of the team. His goal was simple: create an environment where Adrian could meet Sophia without feeling forced or manipulated. He wanted a natural encounter, one where Adrian would make his own judgment, uninfluenced by his father's wealth or status. The day of the event, Edward waited by the door as employees trickled in. Adrian stood beside him, distracted by his phone, checking emails and making casual comments about the food laid out on the table. "Enjoy the event, son. You never know who you might meet," Edward said with a knowing smile. Adrian barely glanced up, nodding absently. Then, just as Edward had hoped, Sophia walked into the room. She was carrying a tray of drinks, her eyes scanning the room for a place to set it down. Edward stepped forward, smiling as he approached her. "Miss Williams," he said in a friendly voice. "Could you please leave the tray over there by the window? I believe that's where the refreshments are meant to go." She looked up and smiled politely, but there was something about her smile that made Edward feel proud. It was a genuine expression, not one calculated for appearances. "Of course, Mr. Edwin," she replied, her voice warm and unpretentious. As Sophia moved to place the tray down, Edward turned to Adrian. "Adrian, this is Sophia Williams. She works in finance." Adrian, still preoccupied with his phone, glanced up and offered a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." Sophia smiled back, her gaze briefly meeting Adrian's, though she didn't seem overly impressed by his casual demeanor. She nodded, returning to her task of setting the tray down. Edward watched with a silent smirk. It was subtle, but Adrian had noticed her. Edward knew that much. He quietly maneuvered around the room, ensuring the two were left alone for a moment. Adrian eventually put his phone away, his curiosity piqued. Sophia was talking to another employee nearby when he approached her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Adrian said, his voice smoother than usual. "I don't think we've properly met. I'm Adrian Harrington." Sophia turned to face him, and this time, her smile was warmer, but there was no hint of awe in her eyes. She simply extended a hand. "Sophia Williams. It's a pleasure." Adrian took her hand, a brief, firm shake. "You're the accountant here, right?" "That's right," she replied, her gaze meeting his with no sign of flattery or hesitation. "I've been with the company for a few years now. It's a good place to work." There was a pause, and for the first time, Adrian found himself intrigued. Good place, huh? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I've been meaning to visit the office more often. Seems like you all do great work. Sophia nodded. We try to. But, you know, it's not always about the work. It's about how you treat people along the way. Adrian's interest deepened. There was something about her that was different from the women he usually met in the corporate world, something real, unpolished. Her words weren't calculated or wrapped in praise, just genuine. As they spoke, Edward watched from across the room, a small smile on his face. He knew this was just the beginning. But it was the first step. The connection was there, subtle yet undeniable. The evening wore on, and though the event was small, it gave Adrian and Sophia the opportunity to speak more. They talked about their careers, their ambitions, and even the little quirks of office life. Adrian began to relax, shedding his usual arrogance and preoccupation with business. He was genuinely enjoying the conversation. And Edward knew it wouldn't be long before his son realized what was so different about Sophia. It wasn't just that she was kind or humble, it was that she was exactly the kind of person Adrian needed to make his life whole. But there was still one thing left to do, one final step to ensure that their connection could blossom into something more. And Edward, despite his disguise, was more determined than ever to see it through. The next few days passed by with an unexpected ease. Adrian began to show a marked change in his demeanor. He had always been charming and charismatic, but with Sophia, something deeper seemed to be growing, an authentic connection. Edward noticed how his son would occasionally mention her, in passing, as if she were becoming a subtle but undeniable part of his thoughts. Still, Edward knew better than to rush things. He needed to let Adrian come to his own conclusions, without pushing him too hard or too fast. Sophia, for her part, seemed just as at ease around Adrian. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or his status, but she was curious about the men behind the title. She had learned long ago not to trust someone simply because of their position or bank account. But Adrian was different. There was something humble in his nature, a soft vulnerability that didn't quite match the polished exterior he wore. One afternoon, as the office was winding down, Edward had his chance. Adrian had asked if he could stay late to finish some work, and as usual, Edward lingered around the lobby, quietly observing. He made sure to act like the gatekeeper, just an ordinary man doing his job. But this time, he had a plan. He wanted to push Adrian into the next step of his journey with Sophia, and he knew that it wouldn't happen by accident. As he sat at his station, Edward saw Sophia pass by. Her shift had ended, but she lingered, looking over some papers that had been left behind. She didn't seem in any rush to leave. Edward smiled to himself, recognizing the perfect moment. He stood up slowly, carefully approaching her. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice low but friendly. She looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Mr. Edwin," she replied, her tone light. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Actually, I was wondering." Edward started, feigning hesitation. "Would you mind walking out with me? I have a little errand to run, and it seems you might be heading in the same direction." Sophia looked at him, a little surprised but not suspicious. "Of course, Mr. Edwin," she replied. "I don't mind at all." They walked together through the building, and as they approached the front exit, Edward slowed his pace, allowing her to take the lead. It was the perfect moment. "By the way," Edward said casually, "I've noticed you and Adrian talking quite a bit recently. Seems like you two are getting along." Sophia paused, then nodded. "Yes, I've enjoyed our conversations. He's not what I expected at first." She chuckled softly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "I thought he'd be like all the other heirs, entitled, maybe even a bit distant. But he's actually, well, more grounded than I thought." Edward's heart swelled. It was exactly what he wanted to hear. But he pressed further, just to see how she would respond. "I think he's starting to like you, too." Sophia stopped walking and turned to face him. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. She seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. I don't know about that," she said slowly, almost as if she was cautious about letting her guard down. "But he's been a good person to talk to. And I don't think I've ever met someone who seems to care as much as he does about the company, even if he doesn't show it." Edward gave her a small smile, sensing an opening. You know, Adrian can be hard to read at times. But I think he's looking for someone genuine. He's not used to people like you, Sophia. People who don't see him for his name or his fortune, but for who he really is. Sophia's eyes softened. That's kind of you to say. Edward nodded, then added, he's here for a while longer, working through some things. Perhaps you and he could get dinner sometime. Just two people enjoying a meal, no pressure. You never know where a simple conversation might. Sophia hesitated, her mind clearly racing. Edward could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but also the curiosity. She was intrigued, and that was enough. I suppose that could be nice, she said after a moment. I'll consider it. With that, they parted ways, but Edward couldn't help the feeling of triumph that swelled in his chest. He had nudged the situation forward just enough to give Adrian a chance. The next day, Adrian had to stay late again, and Edward was at his post, watching from the shadows. He knew that Adrian was trying hard to focus on work, but his mind seemed to wander, often looking at the clock, his thoughts elsewhere. After a while, he saw Adrian approach the desk with a weary sigh. Mr. Edwin, Adrian greeted him with a faint smile, though his eyes still betrayed the weariness of his thoughts. Anything I can help you with, young sir? Edward asked, playing his part. Adrian scratched his chin, looking around the office. Actually, I've been thinking about dinner. I know it's late, but I was thinking of asking Sophia to join me. She seems pretty cool, and I thought we could talk more. Edward smiled inwardly. Adrian was finally taking the bait. You know, young sir, he said, his voice casual, I've seen her here late quite often lately. I think she's really taken to the work here. It might do both of you good to unwind together. Adrian raised an eyebrow, his attention piqued. You think so? I do, Edward replied, hiding the pride in his voice. She's a good person, Adrian. You should trust that. The look in Adrian's eyes was a mix of surprise and contemplation. He paused for a moment before speaking again. All right. Maybe I will. Thanks, Edwin. Edward gave a small nod, his heart pounding. Adrian was on the right path. The question now was whether he would be able to see past his own walls to recognize the woman who had already seen the heart of him, the men beyond the wealth. That evening, Adrian made the call. The dinner was set. And Edward, though still disguised as the humble gatekeeper, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of satisfaction. His plan was working, one careful step at a time. The evening of the dinner arrived, and Edward could hardly contain his excitement. He had watched Adrian grow up with all the privileges money could offer, but now, it seemed his son was taking a chance on something deeper, something real. Sophia was everything Edward had hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She had no agenda, no hidden desires for wealth or status. She was simply a woman of integrity, someone who could bring out the best in Adrian. The dinner took place at a small, cozy restaurant near the city. Edward made sure to stay at his post, pretending to keep watch, but his mind was focused on what would happen when Adrian and Sophia shared this meal. It was a simple setting, no luxury, no extravagant trappings, just two people sitting across from each other, getting to know one another. Adrian, dressed in a crisp shirt but no designer labels, arrived at the restaurant first. He sat at the table, fidgeting with his phone, clearly trying to quell the nervousness that bubbled up inside him. Adrian was used to making decisions in boardrooms, not in personal matters of the heart. But something about Sophia had intrigued him from the start, and tonight, he hoped to finally understand why. Sophia walked in a few moments later, dressed casually but with grace. She wasn't concerned with impressing anyone, her presence alone was enough to command attention. The moment she saw Adrian, she smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made his heart skip. She didn't look at him as the heir to a billion-dollar company, but as a person. That was something Adrian wasn't used to. The moment felt real. They exchanged pleasantries, but neither of them were great talkers at first. It was awkward, but in a comforting way. The conversation flowed slowly at first, about work, the city, their interests. But as the evening wore on, something shifted between them. Adrian found himself asking her about her life, the things she valued, her thoughts on family, on ambition. He was no longer distracted by the allure of wealth. He was just listening. Sophia, in turn, seemed intrigued by Adrian's openness. She talked about her upbringing, her humble beginnings, her struggles and triumphs. She wasn't ashamed of where she came from, and she wasn't looking for a man to rescue her. She wanted a partnership, an equal bond where both could grow. And Adrian could feel it. As dessert was served, a quiet understanding passed between them. They had both entered this evening unsure of where it might lead. But now, they were no longer just two people having dinner. They were two souls who had connected on a level deeper than any material wealth could have ever offered. Adrian put down his fork and looked across the table at her. There was something about her that was different from anyone else he had met, a rare quality he hadn't realized he had been searching for. He felt a sense of peace, something he had been lacking for years. "You know," Adrian began, his voice low but sincere, "I've been a little jaded when it comes to relationships. There are always ulterior motives, always expectations. But tonight, I don't feel that way with you." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I don't know how to explain it, but it feels real with you, Sophia." Sophia's eyes softened. She had been waiting for him to realize it. "It feels real with me, too," she replied quietly. "And that's not something I take lightly." As their eyes locked, both of them knew that this was the beginning of something important, something genuine. Adrian had finally found the kind of woman he needed. And she, in turn, had found the kind of man who, despite his wealth, was willing to open himself up to something deeper. Later that evening, after the dinner ended, they walked together to the parking lot. Adrian offered to drive her home, but she insisted on taking a cab. They stood by the curb for a moment, not saying much, but both feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you for tonight," Adrian said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "I'm glad we did this." Sophia smiled, the kind of smile that made Adrian feel like he'd known her for much longer than he had. "Me too," she replied. "I think we should do it again soon." As she stepped into the cab, Adrian watched it disappear into the night. A sense of calm settled over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction, towards something that was real. Something worth fighting for. Back at the office the next day, Edward couldn't contain his satisfaction. He had watched the dinner unfold from afar, but now, as he saw Adrian walking through the doors with a smile on his face, he knew his plan had succeeded. His son had finally found the person he needed, someone who would love him for who he was, not what he owned. As Adrian approached, Edward greeted him with his usual humbleness. "How was dinner, young sir?" Edward asked, feigning disinterest. Adrian looked up at him, his eyes bright. "It was perfect, Edwin. Absolutely perfect." And though Edward said nothing more, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over him. Adrian didn't know that the man he had come to see as nothing more than a humble gatekeeper was, in fact, his father. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Adrian had learned a lesson that no amount of money could teach him. True connection, true love, came not from status or wealth, but from something far more lasting: trust, kindness, and honesty. And as for Sophia, she had unknowingly passed the final test. She had seen beyond the surface, looked past the veil of wealth and status, and recognized the men beneath. That, in Edward's eyes, was the most important part of the plan all along. The game was over. The pieces had fallen into place. And as Edward watched his son walk away, smiling, with thoughts of a future he had never before imagined, he couldn't help but feel a quiet, satisfied peace. His son had found the one thing money could never buy: true love. We have gotten to the end of this story. If you love this video, kindly like, subscribe to this channel for more, and don't forget to share to others so they will learn from this. Thank you.